Good evening, folks. Um, as many of you are aware, we had trouble recording my presentation last night, and so I did it without recording it on the theory that once we figured out the technical problem, that I could then just record it solo like I was doing a rehearsal, and I did several of these before I did the actual talk. So that's what this is. Without having an actual audience, it's going to be a little bizarre for me, but I'll get through that. I'm going to perhaps run a little bit longer since I'm not keeping people tied down, as it were, who are watching it live. But I'm certainly not going to turn it into a 2-hour talk. So here we go. Let me share this screen. And this is what I want to share. And this is what I want to do. So this is what the presentation is about. 3 books to the Potomac, 3 recent studies of the retreat from Gettysburg. I'm going to talk somewhat about the books, a little bit about the retreat itself, a couple of things in serious detail, a little bit about my personal attitudes, and then at the end, I'm going to talk a little bit about what might have been done to give us a different outcome for the retreat. So let us see if the crucial thing that would not work the other night works. And yes, it does. Although I do not like where yeah, okay. I got rid of that. Excellent. So these are the 3 books on the retreat from Gettysburg that have come out in the last 20 years. Kent Masterson Brown, who I believe is an attorney in Lexington, Kentucky, in real life, wrote a book titled The Retreat from Gettysburg, Lead Logistics and the Pennsylvania Campaign. Eric Wittenberg and 2 of his friends, and we know Eric very well, he's given many presentations to us, wrote a book called One Continuous Fight, The Retreat from Gettysburg and the Pursuit of Lee's Army in Northern Virginia. Eric's book is a Savas Beatie publication, as is the 3rd book by Tom Ryan and Richard Schaus, Lee is Trapped and Must Be Taken, 11 Fateful Days After Gettysburg. It's the most recent book being published in 2019. All 3 of these are good. All 3 of them have their strengths and have their weaknesses. I'm not going to dwell on, oh, this book does this wrong, this book does that wrong, or anything like that. Each one of them does have a theme, though. And for Brown's book, you get the theme from the subtitle. His focus is on Lee's decision-making. Focus, not total focus. That is, he talks about what Meade is doing and what the Union Army is doing, but he's clearly looking very carefully and primarily at what Lee is doing in order to get his army down to the river and then across the river. And a lot of this has to do with logistics. People tend to think that the Confederate invasion of Pennsylvania was what we might call a soft invasion, that they did not really damage much the area that they moved through. Now, certainly, it was nothing like what Sherman did in Georgia or Sheridan did in the Shenandoah Valley. But the fact remains that, for lack of a better term, the Confederates stole a lot. Now, they paid for it in Confederate money, but considering that Confederate money in the state of Pennsylvania was very much worthless, it was essentially equivalent to stealing. Now, what did they steal? Livestock. Every horse, every herd of cattle, every sheep they could get their hands on, they took. The reason is obvious. These are things of military value for an army. Leather. Every time they went into a town, they found the hardware store, and they took every bit of leather goods that the store had, and they also took a lot of raw leather that hadn't been processed into anything yet. They did take some things of decidedly non-military value. There were some wagons captured. We'll talk about this during the retreat, and Yankees going through what was in the wagons found fancy ladies' dresses and stuff like that. But it appears that most of it was stuff of the military value. One thing that is very important that I got out of Brown's book, he does not make this point explicitly, but he brought me to understanding that this was a possibility. Consider what might have happened if Lee had retired on the evening of July 1st. Now, at that point in time, he has beaten up 2 of the 7 Army Corps in the Army of Northern Virginia and beaten them up pretty badly. Killed one of the better officers in the Army of Northern Virginia, John Reynolds. And if he had pulled back that evening and wandered back to Williamsport, Maryland, and crossed the river, he would have had no trouble making that retreat. The Yankees would have woken up in the morning probably and seen that he was gone. And so when Vicksburg surrenders on July 4th, you've got this small raid by Lee's army, during which they came back with a lot of valuable plunder from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and a minor victory over the Army of the Potomac. And this would serve in the nationwide view of public opinion to offset Grant's coming victory at Vicksburg. But by staying to fight it out at Gettysburg, instead of having something to offset Vicksburg, there was something to add to Vicksburg that made what happened at Vicksburg even more significant because the Army of Northern Virginia lost a major battle. It's a very interesting point that somebody who's a better historian, I hope, will someday build upon, at least in an essay. Okay. Eric Wittenberg and J.D. Petruzzi and Michael Nugent wrote a book a few years after Brown's titled One Continuous Fight, The Retreat from Gettysburg and the Pursuit of Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. And as the title, just like Brown's subtitle gave away the game, the title in this one gives away the game. The focus of this book is about the fighting. Now, a lot of there weren't pitched battles on the scale of Gettysburg, not even on the scale of a one-day major battle. I listed here the major battles during the retreat. The first 4 of them are entirely cavalry skirmishes. Important ones, well, Williamsport we would call a cavalry battle. Important skirmishes, but they did involve only cavalry. Funkstown, the fighting on July 10th was an infantry fight. Hagerstown, the fighting on July 12th was an infantry fight. Falling Waters was mostly a cavalry fight, although kind of unusually, it was a Federal cavalry against Confederate infantry fight. But that is their focus. They want to talk about the combats. The most recent book, and the smallest of the 3, fewest pages, but that doesn't mean it's in any way a thin book or not a thorough study, is by Tom Ryan and Richard Schaus, Lee is Trapped and Must Be Taken, 11 Fateful Days After Gettysburg. It's also a Savas Beatie publication. The focus here in some contrast to Brown's book, is on Meade's decision making and Meade's use or failure to use the intelligence data that was available to him during the campaign. Now, this focus of the two writers is due to the fact that both of them spent their career, I believe they are both retired, as intelligence officers in the United States government. I do not know what agency. If I were to ask, I would probably be told we can't tell you that. I don't know. A question to be asked, and it came up in the Q&A when I did this live. How is their writing? Intelligence reports do not have a reputation for being quality literature. It's a well-written book. All three of these, the prose is not remarkable. It's not what I would call Catton-esque. Nobody's going to take any of these books and say, wow, it's some of the best writing on the Civil War I've ever seen. It's solid, workmanlike. They're easy to read. One book, and I'm not going to point fingers, did structure one paragraph in a way that really, really confused me about something. And we'll talk about what that something was at the appropriate moment. But I would say all three are wonderful to read. I'm not going to tell you which one was my favorite. I think at the end you might be able to figure it out. And during the Q&A, we did sort of discuss this. And since there's no Q&A with this tonight, whoever listens to this, watches this solo, is just going to have to say, I guess it was this one. And you can send me an email and I'll tell you. Of the three books, this is the one that is hardest on Meade because, as is mentioned in the first bullet point there, Meade had a tendency not to use the intelligence information he was getting. Some of this might be because he was just in the job of commanding general, but there is reason to think it just might have been part of Meade's DNA as an officer, because a year later he was during the Overland campaign and the siege of Petersburg, he was showing signs of the same attitude. And again, this is going to be part of some of the extra material that I'm going to say here because it was discussed in the Q&A. So a very reasonable, if somewhat simplistic, summary of the three books would be this way. Brown's book is about decision-making from the Confederate side with an emphasis on logistical issues. Wittenberg's book, and I don't mean to slight the co-authors, but I'm going to refer to them by the name of the principal authors. It's a matter of simplicity. Wittenberg's book emphasizes the combats that occurred and the fact that there was, in a sense, almost continuous combat during the 2 weeks, roughly 10 days involved in the retreat. There was at least skirmishing of some kind going on every day. Ryan's book is on decision-making from the federal side with a subtext of intelligence issues. And I think all three of them are very good. Very good. Now, what were my views on the retreat? And I'm dating this to approximately 2000, which is a year before we moved from Alabama to Ann Arbor. Because I didn't really know anything about the retreat at this point in time. I mean, I'd read Coddington's book and a few other books, which did not really go into much detail on the retreat. I could probably have summarized my attitude very simply. More should have been done. What the details of that more might have been, unclear. Could more have been done? I did not know at the time. I do now believe that more could have been done. It certainly seemed to me at the time that having Lee trapped against a flooded river was an enormous missed opportunity, and they ought to have, the Federals ought to have been willing to do a little bit of gambling because the potential payoff of actually trapping Lee's army and doing significant further damage to it as it tried to cross a major river would have been worth risking a little bit. So that was my idea at the time. Now we're going to see this map twice. It outlines the various routes that various components of the armies took during the retreat. And we'll start with the red line. Now, red is often used in map colors for the Confederates because gray doesn't show up well. That's not why I used it here. I used it because this is what is primarily known as the ambulance train. It was being escorted by John Imboden's Virginia Brigade of Cavalry. And there are references to the train, initially at least, being like 17 miles long. Of course, as it retreated from Gettysburg, it got spaced out, pieces got separated, and so on. And so this is the route it took. It went northwest out of Gettysburg towards Chambersburg, but then took this left fork in the road and then down this highway to Williamsport. The brown line shows the route of the bulk of Lee's army, plus the huge quartermaster trains. The Confederates had a huge train that basically was carrying all of the loot they had scooped up in Pennsylvania. And of course, there were herds of horses and cattle and even sheep that had to be driven along if they were going to get them home. And that train went this way, southwest, away from the Confederate lines. No, they weren't leaving from Gettysburg, through Fairfield, across the mountain at Fairfield Gap, and then down through Waynesboro, Middleburg, Hagerstown, and then to Williamsport. Now, there is an error in the map. This map is taken from the official records. And if you look very carefully, there appears to be a road junction here just at the bottom of the mountains of a road leading from Emmitsburg up towards this mountain pass that the Confederates are going to take. That road junction is not before you get up into the mountains. It's on top of the mountain where that splash mark is. Each yellow splash mark represents a significant piece of combat during the retreat. The blue line, as probably everybody has figured out, is the general route that the main body of federal troops took. They pursued Lee on a parallel course with the mountains in between the two armies. Now, this was probably better than what the Navy would call a stern chase, because it gave the Federals an opportunity to get ahead of the Confederates. But it did put the mountains between the two sides. So if the Federals were going to, at any point, advance on the Confederates, they would have to go through the mountains, and there would be the whole issue of having to force a mountain pass. But two very good things happened for the Federals before the retreat even started. Before the battle even ended. Very early on July 3rd, Captain Ulrich Dahlgren took 100 men from the 6th Pennsylvania Cavalry across the mountains into the Cumberland Valley. Now, the Cumberland Valley is this area over here west of this string of mountains. It is generally considered to be the northern extension of the Shenandoah Valley. He had asked for 100 men from his regimental commander and been given a squad. He took this squad over in the direction of Greencastle, Pennsylvania, which is right here. and in the vicinity of Greencastle, he captured a Confederate courier. This Confederate courier had, by definition, dispatches on him, and one of the dispatches, they were not coded, one of the dispatches was telling Lee, we have no reinforcements to send you. And Dahlgren understood that this was important, so he gets on his horse, tells his 5-man squad to stay there, and hightails it back to Gettysburg. He doesn't arrive, as some people have claimed, in time to affect the decision of the Council of War that was held on the night of July 2nd. He arrives after Meade has gone to bed. In fact, Meade had to be awakened. But Meade, of course, is very pleased at this news. And he says something to Dahlgren to the effect of, "This is good work, young man. Can I do anything for you?" And Dahlgren basically says, "Well, I wanted 100 men and I've got 5. So he wrote out an order, give this man 100 men. And so very early on July 3rd, Dahlgren takes his 100 men across the mountains. And this kind of aggressive foresight is something that is missing from the Union Army, in my opinion. It should have been obvious that unless Lee absolutely wins the infamous, never seen, totally decisive victory and wipes out the Army of the Potomac, he's going to have to go back south. And he's probably going to have to go back south the way he came. And so taking 100 men into the Cumberland Valley puts some Yankee soldiers on his path of retreat, his potential path of retreat, and they might be able to do some damage, as in fact they did. Now, on the same afternoon of July 3rd, 300 troopers from a hodgepodge of cavalry regiments set out from Frederick, Maryland, to go down to Williamsport and destroy Lee's pontoon bridge. Now, how did this come about? Some men from the 1st New York Cavalry had done a scouting expedition down that way and found the pontoon bridge and found that there were virtually no Confederates guarding it. There were some, but we're not talking like a full brigade of troops, or not even really a full regiment, I don't think. Therefore, a larger force than that scouting party ought to be able to destroy the bridge. Now, this force of federal troops was basically the Harper's Ferry garrison, plus the remnants of General Milroy's command that had been defeated at Winchester in early June. And they were based right now in Frederick, Maryland, which is slightly off the map down here. And so they're not that far from Williamsport. They crossed the mountains. They were sent by General French, the commander of the Harper's Ferry garrison. They were sent out as soon as he heard the cannonade of what became known as Pickett's charge. They did not arrive at Williamsport until the pre-dawn hours of July 4th. They captured most of the Confederates that were guarding the bridge. They set the bridge on fire and detached it from the Maryland shore. So loosened the current. It was swept a little bit downstream, burning, and eventually came up on the Virginia shore, and the fire burned itself out. Some of the pontoons survived. Most did not, but some did. But at this point, Meade is going to have a difficult time crossing the river. There is a ford at Williamsport. I have said the bridge was at Williamsport. That's a mistake. It was actually at Falling Waters, which is a little bit downstream from Williamsport. We'll see a map of that in a bit. The river has not yet risen. The rainstorm that causes the river to rise comes on the afternoon of July 4th. So Lee could cross in the absence of that rainstorm at the ford at Williamsport, but it's going to be difficult to get an entire army plus all of the material they have with them across at one single ford, particularly if there's any opposition. But the first moves of the retreat come on July 4th, and that's when Lee pulls back the Confederate left wing that had been fronting Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill. These troops were largely from Johnson's and Early's division. Robert Rhodes had been mostly in the town itself. So the Confederate line, instead of mimicking the Union fishhook, is now a much more linear line. These blue arrows do not represent Federal attacks. They are more probes or patrols. Have the Confederates really left? And as you know, for example, one set of men was sent out from Culp's Hill and traced out the entire front. Yes, they're gone. And people went forward from all these other places. Yes, they're gone. So on the 4th of July, not, a lot is happening, but it's happening behind the Confederate lines. Because the Confederates are very busy setting up 2 wagon trains. Let me talk about that from this slide. The ambulance train that we referred to before, and let me be clear, I'm going to use that terminology, but it was more than just ambulances of wounded men. It had the First Corps subsistence and quartermaster trains, and the Third Corps subsistence and quartermaster trains. This is the train that was being escorted by General Imboden. It is formed up along Hare Ridge. You can just see Hare Ridge here, and departed northwest up the I cannot talk. The Chambersburg Pike at about 3 or 4 in the afternoon on July 4th, shortly after the rainstorm began, a vicious, vicious thunderstorm. The quartermaster train, and again, I'm going to call it the quartermaster train, but it had ambulances as well. It had the Second Corps ambulances, and it also had the Second Corps subsistence and quartermaster train. And the reason for that is this was being led by Major John Harmon. John Harmon is famous in the Confederate Army. He was Stonewall Jackson's quartermaster, and he was known as the only soldier who could curse in Jackson's presence and get away with it. And the reason was he was a great quartermaster. He got Jackson's trains moving when Jackson needed them to where Jackson needed them. And if Jackson's attitude was, if he needs to cuss out a few Army mules to do it, okay, I'll turn my ears the other way. God will understand. So he gets an earlier start. He sets out at about 3 or 4 in the morning of July 4th. Now that's significant because he gets an earlier start, of course. He's got a much longer train. It's at least 22 miles long. Imboden's train was 17. Harmon's train might have been 40 miles long. There is a section in one of the books, again, I'm not going to point fingers, that it's unclear whether it's talking about 2 sections of Harmon's train or what. And I think it might have been talking about two different pieces of Harmon's train, and therefore you should add the 220 miles together and get 40 miles. But anyway, the Federals had signal stations with high-powered telescopes and signal corps flags on all of the high ground, not just at Gettysburg itself, but actually stretching south into Maryland. And they saw Harmon's train going up over the mountain. And that information was communicated to the Federal Army, which is what brings us to our next slide, the first and in some ways the most important fight of the retreat, although that's perhaps an exaggeration. The fight at Monterey Pass. If you remember, and I'm not going to go back, you can back up if you're listening to this recorded. 2 or 3 slides, I talked about a road from Emmitsburg that led up and intersected the road from Fairfield. This is that road. The blue arrows represent Judson Kilpatrick's reinforced cavalry division. He's got Custer's Wolverine Brigade. He's got the remnants of what was known as Farnsworth's brigade, but Farnsworth was killed. So it's being led by somebody whose name escapes me right now. And he had picked up a brigade belonging to the 2nd Division, commanded by a man named Pennock Huey. And so he's advancing up this road, intending to strike this train. Lee assigned no escort to Harmon's train. None. Ewell assigned a single cavalry battalion and 1 battery of artillery. Now, I don't know how large the cavalry battalion was, but the detachment of it that was guarding the approach up this road, commanded by a man named Captain George Emack, this gentleman, was about 200 men. And they took up position here. And as you can see, there's a series of splash marks. Now, how did 200 men hold off an entire Federal cavalry division? Well, you got to remember, this is happening at night. Well, maybe you don't remember because I haven't said that yet. Kilpatrick did not set out from Emmitsburg until 9 o'clock at night. At the end, we'll talk about why that happened. It is in a driving rainstorm. So there's no moon. The only light you get is from lightning flashes. And these are not broad plains. This is a mountain pass road. It's a narrow defile. You cannot deploy your troops. Emack's 200 men are probably filling the entire space of the road. So Emack is able to delay the Confederates, the Yankees, at each of these moments. And basically what he would do is he would fight, his men would fire a volley, and then you'd have the bright flash in the darkness. The Federals would then shoot at the muzzle flashes, but of course by now Emack's men had left, and they would take up a new position. Then they would fire another volley and rinse and repeat all the way up the mountain until they reached the main road. Some Confederates tried to get there to help Emack. William Jones Cavalry Brigade was stationed at Fairfield. It was guarding the entrance to the pass. And Jones sent 2 regiments to try to reinforce Emack, but of course they've got to pass the wagon trains, which means they're not going to make good progress. Jones and his staff and escort made better progress, and they got there to the scene of the fighting before the 2 cavalry regiments did. And Emack begged Jones to stop the trains, and Jones said, no, they can't be stopped. And so the inevitable happened. Emack's men were scattered. Jones was almost captured. Um, and Kilpatrick's men broke into the train. They burned about 130 wagons. They captured a bunch of ambulances of wounded men from Rhodes's division. And then they retreated westward down the mountain, back this way, pursuing the rest of the train, which by now was in Hagerstown, Maryland. Now, what might have happened, as successful as this was, it was kind of belated. What might have happened if the Federals had moved up here sooner and had posted troops in Fairfield Gap before the Confederates began their retreat? That would have been very bad news. So what are some of the other figures on casualties and things lost here? There were about 130 wagons destroyed, 300 wagons destroyed, 1,300 men captured. Kilpatrick owned up to 45 casualties, killed, wounded, and missing. This could have been a disaster for the Confederates. It was bad enough as it was, but it could have been a disaster. The rain did not help Kilpatrick. The late start did not help Kilpatrick. The valiant defense by Captain Emack's 200 Marylanders did not help Kilpatrick. But it could have been much worse. So now let's talk about the adventures of John Imboden with his train. And again, each of these splash marks represents a clash. And the first one, and I think this is correct in terms of chronological order, the first one occurred at Greencastle right here, which is when Dahlgren struck the column. Now, of course, this is on July 5th by now, because Imboden did not sit out until very late on July 4th. So this is the morning of July 5th. And the train has gotten strung out. We'll talk about that in a minute. Dahlgren strikes the train at Greencastle. He destroys about 130 wagons, takes 200 men POW. Some of those prisoners were released in a counterattack. But he harassed the train all the way through Greencastle, or all the way into Greencastle. He almost caught Imboden himself. And then he joined up with Kilpatrick. Remember, I mentioned that Kilpatrick, after fighting the battle up here at Monterey Pass, crossed into the Cumberland Valley here, and he actually proceeded down to Williamsport this way. Dahlgren linked up with Kilpatrick on July 6th. This is a spot in Maryland. I think this was the second combat. This was a spot in Maryland, a place called Cunningham's Crossroads. And again, the troops from the Harper's Ferry garrison, or the leavings from Milroy's defeat, were also participating in this. General French sent forward some cavalry, and they caught up with the head of Imboden's brigade just as it crossed the line, and they scooped up about 130 wagons. That seems to be a common figure for Yankees to report. 600 horses and mules, and 650 men POW. This is a combat that occurred at the end of the long wagon train. Imboden was being pursued by most of David Gregg's 2nd Cavalry Division. That one brigade under Huey was with Kilpatrick. And one of Gregg's brigades was commanded by his cousin, John Irvin Gregg, and Fitz Lee was acting as a rear guard. Well, Gregg got the better of Fitz Lee once, swung around, scooped up about 2,800 men and a bunch of wagons as they were going over the mountains. This occurred at a place called Caledonia Furnace, which I believe is iron furnace owned by Thaddeus Stevens. Also, Gregg reported, David Gregg reported, that trailing behind Imboden's train, they were scooping up stragglers the entire way. He picked up about 2,000 stragglers, he said, during the course of his entire pursuit. Now, you might notice there is a splash mark up here indicating some kind of action occurred up there. And you also might note that there are no red arrows indicating that any Confederates went there. It's because they weren't supposed to. People talk about the stolid stupidity sometimes of the Pennsylvania Dutch farmer. Well, one of them, and there are differing accounts as to who. I mean, in one book, a person is named, and in others, it's just somebody, was really smart. As the train moves along, it takes this left fork in the road, and it comes down here to near Marion, Pennsylvania, and there's an intersection there. Now, I would like to think that the average Confederate soldier had enough sense of direction to know that, okay, I've got 3 possible directions here. I can turn left, I can go straight, or I can turn right. Now, I would think that they might understand that maybe there might be some confusion about whether I go straight or turn left. There shouldn't be any confusion that turning right is a bad idea, because turning right is going to be going north. But 12 ambulances did exactly that. They went to a house in glorious innocence, knocked on the door. This is in pitch black of the night of July 4th to July 5th, woke up the farmer and asked him, which is the way to Williamsport? And the farmer, thinking very quick, says, and I thought about imitating the German accent, but that would not be fair and it wouldn't be a good idea. Oh, go that way, pointing up north, meaning take the right turn, when Williamsport is down that way. So the 12 ambulances dutifully turn right, proceed up to Chambersburg, and they enter the town square at Chambersburg. And at this time, some of the men are arguing with each other because some people are saying, yeah, the river's down over there. You just go down that hill and you'll see the river. And somebody else is saying, there is no church like that at Williamsport. And here comes a deputation of the city council armed with every makeshift weapon they can to take the men prisoner and eventually turn them over to the federal authorities. It's a heck of a funny story. I originally thought that this occurred here at this fork in the road, where it might have been more natural to miss taking the turn to the left that they were supposed to take. And then in reviewing, actually fairly late in preparing the talk, in reviewing the details, no, it happened down here near Marion. Where's my cursor go? It happened down here near Marion and involved a much more severe right turn to head up to Chambersburg, and so they messed up pretty badly. Both trains, all things considered, made pretty good time. They got to Williamsport on July 6th. They also had to fight a battle against the Federal cavalry divisions of Kilpatrick and Buford, who attacked Williamsport. And basically, the only troops available to defend were Fitzlee's cavalry brigade and Imboden's cavalry brigade, and they were able to fight them off. If Buford and Kilpatrick had been able to win this fight, things might have been real serious for Lee. But this is the battle, incidentally, and it's one of the few urban combats of the Civil War. It occurred in the town of Williamsport. Cavalry squadrons were making charges down streets. This is where Ulrich Dahlgren got the leg wound that cost him his leg, so that in the following March, when he leads the Dahlgren doesn't lead, he's part of the Dahlgren Kilpatrick raid. He is a one-legged colonel and is killed towards the end of the raid. So they get down to Williamsport and they can't cross the river because the bridge is gone. And because of the rainstorm on the night of July 4th to 5th, the river has risen. They can't use the ford. So they're in a bit of a pickle. Now, what happens is Imboden is nothing else if not quick-witted. He very quickly sets men to work building rafts. And they set up a ferry system, what I would call a roped ferry. That is, some brave soul swam the river and took a rope. And so with the rope tied up between two trees, men on the ferry would pull themselves along. But this is slow. The rafts were not huge. You could get maybe 2 wagons on a raft at a time, and or a few horses, cows, or sheep, and maybe some prisoners of war. But they managed, and it took a long time. You didn't exactly, this wasn't a motorboat going across. It took a long time. You didn't get many trips in during the day, but they were able to get a significant fraction, in fact, perhaps maybe almost all of the loot, if you will, from the campaign over the river. They were also able to get ammunition. Lee had sent a message asking for ammunition to be sent. And there were some Confederates, not even full regimental strength, I don't think, south of the river with ammunition to give to Lee's men, and that was taken back across the river. So what happens on July 5th? I've jumped ahead to July 6th. Let's go back to July 5th. This is when the main body of the Confederates starts to withdraw. They follow the huge set of trains through Fairfield Gap. Longstreet is leading the way, Hill is second, and Ewell is bringing up the rear. And outside of Frederick, at a place called Granite Hill, Early's division of Ewell's corps actually deploys in a line because Sedgwick, this is the only pursuit, direct pursuit that Meade orders, has asked Sedgwick to follow the Confederates for a while. And Early deploys, and they basically look at each other for a while. There may have been a few shots exchanged, but it doesn't merit being called a battle. And Meade eventually decides to bring Sedgwick back. The notion of a stern chase is not fully engaged in. They do delegate one brigade commanded by Thomas Neal from Sedgwick's corps to follow the Confederates. He's reinforced with some artillery and he's given some cavalry. So you might, in modern military parlance, it would have been called Task Force Neal. And he follows the Confederates over the mountains. He occasionally forces the rear guard to deploy. Occasionally, there are skirmishes, no major pitched battles, but he harasses the rear of the Confederates. And I've already told you about what was going on with Gregg's cavalry division and Imboden's train, with Fitzlee acting as a rear guard. So what might have been done? Well, before I show you a picture, let's talk about a few things. The Yankees were getting intelligence throughout the retreat from prisoners that were getting away. Some Yankees were left behind because they were too badly wounded to transport. And these men were recaptured when the aid stations were reoccupied. We'll probably hear some about this next month from next month's speaker. But occasionally, some prisoners would get away. Most of the prisoners were with Harmon's column. They were being escorted by Pickett's division, which is an entire subplot of this whole story, because Pickett thought that this was demeaning duty for his men to have to do. Men would occasionally escape from this column, and they would find their way back to the Federal armies, and they would tell the Federals where the Confederates were and what the conditions of the Confederates were. One of the criticisms in the Ryan and Schaus book is that Meade did not seem to pay attention to much of this intelligence that he was getting. Meade did not seem to pay much attention to the so-called Bureau of Military Information, which Hooker had set up. Now, some of this might be due to the fact that Meade had only been in Army command since June 28th. And we have to give Meade full props for being in a new position. He's working with a chief of staff he hates and a staff that's loyal to his predecessor. He's lost some of his best subordinate officers. Reynolds is killed. Hancock is severely wounded. John Gibbon is severely wounded. Sickles, who was no friend of Meade, but at least was aggressive, is badly wounded and is not part of the retreat. So some degree of caution in Meade is understandable. And something I forgot to mention when I did this originally, Meade's orders, literally his written orders that he was given when he was given the command, were to cover Washington and Baltimore. So to get too aggressive and not keep his army between where the Confederates were and Washington and Baltimore could be considered insubordination. But to not believe information that he's getting. And this is not entirely due to just Meade being new. A year later, this is something I learned very recently in reading something else that I wanted to read for another purpose. The next summer, during the siege of Petersburg, Grant reorganized the Bureau of Military Information. Meade wanted to get rid of it completely. He had no faith in it, didn't trust it, whatever. That was a thing in July and August of 1864. It was a thing in July of 1863. And this is one of the things that Tom Ryan criticizes Meade for in his book. And this is something else that Ryan talks about a lot. Now, yes, that's a fantasy picture, but think about what it would imply. So here's Williamsport. Here's the Potomac River. The Potomac River is past flood stage from the rainstorm that occurred on the night of July 5th, or July 4th to July 5th. There's the ford at Williamsport, and this is Falling Waters where the pontoon bridge was. The Federals had bridging material at Harper's Ferry. And even though they got a very slow start in their pursuit of Lee, the main Federal infantry did not leave the vicinity of Gettysburg until July 7th. I kid you not. And in a second, we'll talk about that. Nonetheless, the Federals were able to get down to this part of the river while Meade is still trapped at Williamsport. So it would have been possible to cross a couple of brigades at Harper's Ferry. Now, do I think the two Federal brigades are going to hold off the entire Army of Northern Virginia? Of course not. It's going to make crossing a ford or crossing a pontoon bridge very difficult and very costly, though. You're going to have good officers, men who know they're not there to make a last stand and get overwhelmed once Lee gets superior numbers across the river. But to hold him up and make crossing difficult. Shoot, if this had been done early enough, the pontoon bridge could not have been rebuilt, because at some point you have to attach it to the Virginia shore. And if there is a Federal brigade there, even a Federal cavalry brigade, reinforced with some artillery, they can't rebuild that pontoon bridge. And so this is what I think might have been done. It's a counterfactual. Usually I do not like counterfactuals. But this is one that I think is worth exploring. Do the Federals have commanders and brigades strong enough and commanders smart enough to carry out a mission like this? I think John Buford and his cavalry division, reinforced with a little extra artillery, could have done this and done a good job of it. But that is my presentation. I apologize for having to do this a second time, for not having the presentation ready last night when we did the thing live. There were technical issues, and I wasn't able to figure them out until it was nearly midnight, and that was not the time to try and do this. Thank you very much for listening. Send me email. My email address is on the website. Send me email if you have questions or things that you want to elaborate upon or whatever. But thank you all very much. Let me end things now if I can figure out. Yeah, here we are. Stop the share and stop the recording. Good night, everybody.